The startup world is filled with legends of underdogs, founders who began with no credentials, no funding, no network, sometimes not even a clear plan, yet somehow climbed from obscurity to industry-shaping influence through courage, resilience, timing, and a refusal to quit when the world dismissed them. These stories captivate us because they represent a deeper truth about innovation. Breakthroughs rarely emerge from the obvious winners. Instead, they come from outsiders who see what insiders ignore, who believe in possibilities deemed impractical, and who harness the momentum of resourcefulness rather than the comfort of abundance. The underdog narrative is not merely motivational, it is structural to the startup ecosystem, where asymmetry between ambition and resources, between vision and reality, forces founders to invent creative solutions, forging cultures and products that incumbents cannot replicate. Understanding these underdog journeys reveals how startups transform weakness into advantage, how constraints fuel ingenuity, and how some of the most influential companies in history emerged from beginnings that seemed laughably small. Consider the archetype of the garage startup. While the trope has become cliché, its power lies in what it symbolizes: a team with no institutional support, building with whatever tools they can afford, driven solely by belief in an idea. Apple began in a garage, not because it was romantic, but because it was the only space Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs could afford while assembling the first Apple I. What looked like a hobby project evolved into a revolution in personal computing, not because of initial resources, but because of extraordinary vision and relentless iteration. Similarly, Google's founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin built their early search engine on cheap hardware, repurposed components, and servers cobbled together from scrap parts. Their PageRank algorithm, dismissed as an academic curiosity, eventually reshaped the internet. These stories underscore the fundamental truth: greatness at inception is not a requirement for greatness at scale. Yet not all underdogs start with technical brilliance. Some begin with pure necessity. Airbnb's founders could not pay rent, so they turned their living room into a makeshift bed and breakfast during a conference in San Francisco. Investors mocked the idea. Users hesitated. The founders resorted to selling novelty cereal boxes, Obama O's and Cap'n McCain's, to survive long enough to iterate on their concept. Their willingness to endure discomfort, stigma, and rejection became the foundation of a hospitality empire that upended an entire industry. WhatsApp began as a simple status update tool built by founders who had been rejected from Facebook. Yet its simplicity, reliability, and privacy focus resonated globally, leading to one of the largest acquisitions in tech history. Canva emerged from rejection after rejection in Silicon Valley. Yet Melanie Perkins persisted, refining her pitch until investors finally listened. Her company would democratize design tools for tens of millions. These underdog stories share common patterns that illuminate how seemingly small beginnings become massive outcomes. One pattern is resource constraint as creative fuel. When founders lack money, they compensate with speed, scrappiness, and obsessive focus. They become customer-driven because they cannot afford waste. They become resourceful because they must. Constraints shape a culture where every decision matters, and where innovation becomes necessity, not luxury. Another pattern is non-traditional backgrounds that produce unique insights. Many successful founders were outsiders to their industries, unburdened by conventional assumptions. Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia knew nothing about hospitality, which allowed them to question why strangers couldn't share homes. Melanie Perkins was a design tutor, not a technologist, giving her intimate insight into why existing tools frustrated everyday users. Jan Koum grew up in Ukraine under surveillance, shaping WhatsApp's privacy ethos. Underdogs succeed precisely because they see with fresh eyes. A third pattern is relentless iteration in the face of apathy or ridicule. Underdog founders often endure long stretches where growth is non-existent, feedback is discouraging, and the world simply does not care. What separates those who rise from those who quit is the ability to persist with humility, testing hypotheses, adjusting strategy, and refining product-market fit bit by bit. Slack began as a failed video game company. Instagram emerged from a bloated app that no one wanted. YouTube started as a dating site before pivoting into video sharing. The underdog advantage lies in flexibility. lacking a powerful brand to protect or large customers to appease. Small startups can pivot freely, discovering insights that rigid incumbents overlook. A fourth pattern is cultural cohesion under pressure. Underdog startups often develop tight-knit teams united by shared struggle. The bond formed through late nights, shared uncertainty, and improvisation becomes an intangible yet critical advantage. These teams often move faster, trust deeper, and collaborate more fluidly than teams in large, well-funded corporations. Pressure becomes a forge that shapes resilience. This emotional cohesion, forged in difficulty, later becomes organizational identity. Another core element of Underdog success is the mastery of storytelling. When startups lack traction or pedigree, their primary tool for attracting early believers, employees, customers, and investors is narrative. Underdog founders learn to articulate possibility with such clarity that others feel compelled to join the impossible. Storytelling is not exaggeration. It is the translation of conviction into shared belief. The greatest founders do not simply describe what they are building, they describe why it must exist. This rhetorical force becomes the gravitational pull that gathers allies, especially when the world is skeptical. The underdog archetype also thrives because it aligns with the psychology of disruption. Incumbents are optimized for stability, predictability, and risk mitigation. Startups, by contrast, are optimized for discovery. Underdogs enter markets where the old guard has grown complacent, bloated, or blind to shifting trends. Netflix disrupted Blockbuster because it embraced an emerging behavior on-demand consumption that incumbents resisted. Uber challenged taxi monopolies precisely because traditional systems had calcified. Underdogs thrive in the gaps between what customers want and what institutions provide. Their smallness becomes agility. Their weakness becomes speed. Their lack of legacy becomes freedom. Global underdog stories further illustrate how innovation thrives in unlikely places. In Africa, M-Pesa transformed mobile phones into banking tools for millions who lacked access to financial institutions. In India, Byju's began as a tutoring class and grew into a global education platform. In Vietnam, Sky Mavis launched Axie Infinity from a tiny team and ignited a global conversation about digital ownership. These founders broke through not because they began with abundance, but because they possessed insight, persistence, and cultural awareness that richer competitors could not replicate. Yet the underdog story is not merely inspirational, it is also essential to the functioning of the startup ecosystem. Venture capital depends on outsiders challenging the status quo. Talent migrates toward bold ideas that promise meaning. Markets evolve because small entrants introduce alternatives that eventually reshape consumer expectations. Every unicorn was once a long shot. Every long shot was once dismissed, and every dismissal became part of the underdog's fuel. But beneath the drama lies a deeper truth. The journey from zero to hero is not linear. It is chaotic, emotionally taxing, and filled with failures invisible to the public. Founders battle self-doubt, financial strain, rejection, loneliness, and exhaustion. Many fail multiple times before achieving traction. What the world later calls overnight success is almost always the result of years spent in obscurity, refining craft and character. The hero emerges not from victory alone, but from the accumulation of invisible struggles that sharpen intuition and strengthen resolve. In the end, underdog stories endure because they reveal the human dimension of entrepreneurship. They remind us that innovation is not merely a technical process, but a psychological one. That progress is driven not just by capital and code, but by courage and conviction. And that transformative change often begins with someone ordinary deciding to attempt something extraordinary. These founders start with little more than a problem, a dream, and the audacity to believe the world might listen. And when their ideas finally break through, when users flock to their creations and investors chase their momentum, the world forgets how improbable it all once seemed, celebrating the ascent while overlooking the countless invisible steps that carried them from obscurity to influence, from nothing to something, from zero to hero, not through luck or inevitability, but through a series of deliberate choices sacrifices, reinventions, and unglamorous battles that the world rarely sees. In the second phase of this exploration, the narrative digs deeper into the psychology, strategy, and structural forces that shape underdog trajectories, revealing why some founders transform their disadvantages into momentum, while others, facing similar obstacles, quietly disappear. How ecosystems either amplify or suffocate underdog potential, and why the myth of the underdog persists as one of the most powerful cultural forces in entrepreneurship, even as the startup landscape becomes more competitive, more capitalized, and more complex. One of the defining characteristics of successful underdogs is their ability to convert adversity into identity. Instead of perceiving lack of resources as a handicap, they internalize it as a challenge that sharpens their resilience. This subtle psychological shift alters how founders respond to obstacles. When an underdog encounters rejection from investors, customers, or mentors, they do not interpret it as a verdict, but as a signal to adjust approach. Their limited runway forces them to focus on what truly matters, solving a real problem for a specific group of users. They cannot afford distractions, lavish branding exercises, or premature scaling. This constraint-based discipline often results in products with extraordinary clarity and usability. The world tends to assume that underdogs succeed despite their limitations. In truth, they often succeed because of them. Another powerful force is what can be called outsider advantage. Underdog founders frequently come from outside the industries they transform. Their lack of conventional training frees them from inherited assumptions. They ask naive questions that expose hidden inefficiencies. They challenge rituals incumbents take for granted. Disruption rarely comes from within the establishment because insiders are incentivized to preserve the status quo. Outsiders, by contrast, have nothing to lose and everything to question. This outsider mindset allows them to attack opportunities invisible to those embedded within traditional systems. It is why teachers built edtech platforms, gamers built blockchain games, immigrants built fintech solutions, and artists built creative tools. Their distance from conventional wisdom becomes a source of strategic advantage. But underdogs do not rely solely on mindset, they rely on method. One of the most important underdog strategies is hyper-focus on customer love. Big companies build for markets. Underdogs build for individuals. They obsess over small groups of early adopters, learning from every friction point, celebrating every tiny success. This intimacy creates a depth of understanding incumbents cannot replicate. It also produces the kind of word-of-mouth enthusiasm that ignites organic growth. When a small, scrappy startup delivers delight to the few eventually bring the many. This bottom-up momentum becomes the underdog's most powerful weapon, especially when they lack capital for traditional marketing. Another essential tactic is rapid adaptability. Underdogs cannot afford to be rigid. They pivot when evidence contradicts assumptions. They experiment constantly. They discard sunk costs quickly. This elasticity makes them uniquely suited to navigate markets filled with ambiguity. The world remembers Slack as a runaway success, but forgets that it emerged from the ashes of a failed gaming company. The world remembers Instagram's simplicity, but forgets the bloated app from which it pivoted. The world remembers Zoom's meteoric rise, but forgets its founder had been rejected by dozens of investors. Underdogs win because they move with the market rather than against it. At the ecosystem level, underdog success depends on access to opportunity. Startups thrive in environments where capital, talent, and mentorship circulate freely. Silicon Valley became an underdog factory because its culture celebrated experimentation, tolerated failure, and rewarded boldness. Other regions are now cultivating similar dynamics. Bangalore with its engineering talent, Lagos with its fintech ingenuity, Ho Chi Minh City with its youthful digital economy. Ecosystems that embrace the underdog narrative create permission structures, signals that it is acceptable to try, fail, iterate, and try again. This cultural infrastructure is as important as financial infrastructure. Without it, even the most brilliant founders may remain hidden. However, underdog stories also risk being romanticized. Not every founder who struggles is destined for greatness. For every Airbnb, dozens of equally scrappy teams fade silently. The brutal truth is that effort alone does not guarantee success. Timing, market readiness, distribution channels, competitive dynamics, and luck all play indispensable roles. But even here, underdogs have a unique edge. Their willingness to endure longer than logic might dictate. They stretch limited resources further. They learn faster because failure costs them more. They pay attention to nuance. They cultivate empathy for users because they too feel marginalized. And while not every underdog becomes a hero, the ones who do often alter the trajectory of entire industries. What happens when the underdog finally becomes the incumbent? This is one of the most fascinating transitions in the startup world. A company that once embodied scrappiness must now build systems, manage scale, and defend its position against new disruptors. Ironically, the rise from zero to hero often plants the seeds of future vulnerability. As organizations mature, they risk losing the agility and hunger that fueled their ascent. Success can calcify into bureaucracy. Vision can narrow into maintenance. The very forces that once propelled the business forward can become constraints. This is why companies like Amazon, Netflix, and Tesla deliberately cultivate internal cultures that preserve underdog mentality even as they dominate global markets. They understand that complacency is lethal, that somewhere, another underdog is already building the future. The personal transformation of the founder is equally profound. Underdog founders begin as hustlers, doing everything themselves, surviving on improvisation and raw belief. But as the company grows, they must evolve into leaders, strategists, visionaries, capable of orchestrating teams and guiding organizations. This shift can be emotionally challenging. The identity forged in scarcity does not always translate smoothly into abundance. Yet the founders who navigate this transition successfully become powerful symbols of what is possible when resilience meets opportunity. Ultimately, underdog stories resonate because they affirm a universal truth. Potential is not determined by starting point. Innovation is not confined to elite institutions. Revolutionary ideas do not require permission. The world's most transformative companies often begin with people who were underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. These individuals reclaim their narrative through action, building credibility step by step until the world is forced to reconsider its assumptions. And when underdogs rise, when they prove that vision can overcome resources, that courage can overcome doubt, that persistence can overcome rejection, they invite others to believe in possibilities previously unimaginable. In the end, the journey from zero to hero is not just a business story, but a human one, a testament to the power of grit, creativity, empathy, and belief. Underdogs shape industries because they understand struggle. They change markets because they question orthodoxy. They inspire others because they embody transformation. And through their improbable ascent, they remind us that innovation remains, at its core, the art of turning limitations into leverage, challenges into catalysts, and humble beginnings into legacies that endure long after the world forgets how improbable their victories once were. Completed.